Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to ancient Rome, where marble columns cast long shadows, and the most powerful people in the world played dangerous games with their hearts. Picture this: the year is 41 BCE, and across the Mediterranean, two of history's most magnetic figures are about to collide in a love story that will shake the very foundations of the Roman Empire. Their names? Mark Antony and Cleopatra. This is their story. So grab your favorite blanket, dim those lights, and let your mind wander to a time when love could topple empires. If you're new here, welcome to Hearts in History. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Drop a comment below and let's connect across time zones while we explore this ancient tale together. Chapter 1: Bellowing Echoes of Rome. The Forum Romanum in 41 BCE was never quiet. Even in the early morning hours, before the sun painted the marble columns gold, you could hear the whispers starting, merchants setting up their stalls, senators walking briskly toward important meetings. And somewhere, threading through all that everyday noise, stories about Mark Antony, stories about a queen from Egypt who had captured his attention in the most inconvenient way possible. Rome was at the height of its power then, streets lined with limestone and travertine, stretching from the Tiber River to the 7 hills that cradled the eternal city. But power, as any Roman would tell you, was never permanent. It shifted like sand between fingers. And in 41 BCE, that power was splitting along dangerous lines. 3 men controlled everything: Octavian, Lepidus, and Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, each watching the others carefully. Antony was 42 years old that year, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that filled a room before he even spoke. Soldiers loved him because he fought alongside them, not from the safety of a tent. The people loved him because he understood spectacle, the way bread and games could win hearts faster than speeches. But Antony had one weakness that everyone in Rome was starting to notice. He fell hard for extraordinary women. 300 miles across the Mediterranean, another kind of power was stirring. Alexandria, the jewel of the ancient world, where the lighthouse stood 200 feet tall and the library held scrolls containing all human knowledge. This was Cleopatra's kingdom. She was 28, spoke 9 languages, and had already survived more palace intrigue than most people could imagine. Egypt was wealthy beyond Roman dreams, but it needed Rome's protection to survive. Back in Rome, people were talking, not the loud kind of talking you hear in taverns, but the careful whispers that spread through marble hallways and private gardens. Antony had been in the East for months now, supposedly organizing Rome's new territories. But the letters coming back, well, they mentioned fewer military victories and more time spent in Alexandria, more time spent with Egypt's queen. That worried people who understood how these things worked. The thing about Rome in 41 BCE was that everything mattered: a general's choice of wine at dinner, which gods he prayed to, definitely which foreign queens he spent time with, because Rome had spent centuries building an empire, and they'd done it by being very careful about who they trusted. Eastern queens, especially beautiful ones with their own armies and treasuries, made Romans nervous. History was full of warnings about such things. Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son, was watching all of this from his villa outside Rome. He was younger than Antony, barely 22, but he had inherited something valuable from Caesar: patience, the ability to wait for the right moment. And as summer turned to autumn, Octavian was beginning to sense that Antony might be making the kind of mistake that could change everything, the kind that creates opportunities for patient young men. The irony was that Rome itself had been built on love stories. Romulus and Remus raised by wolves, Aeneas fleeing Troy for a new homeland. Even Julius Caesar had his affairs, his dramatic romances that people whispered about in the same marble hallways. But those stories ended with Rome growing stronger. This one, this one felt different, like watching storm clouds gather on a clear day, knowing the weather was about to change completely. In the markets near the Circus Maximus, vendors sold everything from British tin to Chinese silk. The empire brought the world to Rome's doorstep, but it also brought complications, foreign customs, foreign gods, foreign ideas about how power should work. Romans prided themselves on being practical about these things, but there were limits, and when those limits involved Egypt's gold and Egypt's queen, practical became more complicated. The senators who gathered each morning in the Curia Julia knew something was shifting. You could see it in how they grouped together, speaking in lower voices than usual. Messages from Alexandria weren't just military reports anymore. They described banquets that lasted until dawn, golden barges floating down the Nile, a Roman general living like an Egyptian pharaoh. These weren't necessarily bad things, but they were unexpected, and Rome had never liked unexpected. What made this moment so dangerous was timing. The Roman Republic had just died with Julius Caesar, transformed into something new. The empire was still finding its shape, still deciding what it wanted to become. In times like these, every choice mattered twice as much. Every alliance could tip the balance, and if one of Rome's most powerful generals was falling under the influence of a foreign queen, well, that changed the mathematics of everything. But here's what the whispers in Rome couldn't capture: the way candlelight looked different in Alexandria, the way conversations flowed when two brilliant people found each other across the space between empires, the way political necessity could transform, almost without anyone noticing, into something much more personal, something that made careful calculations seem less important than the sound of someone's laughter echoing off ancient stone walls. By winter of 41 BCE, even the street sweepers in Rome knew something significant was happening in the east. Not because anyone told them directly, but because powerful people were acting differently. More meetings behind closed doors, more messengers arriving at odd hours. The kind of tension that settles over a city when everyone knows a storm is coming, but nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. This is where our story really begins, in that space between what Rome expected from its generals and what the heart wants when it finds something unexpected, between the marble columns where senators made careful plans and the golden light of Alexandria, where two people were discovering that some forces are stronger than empires. Some connections change the course of history itself, even when they probably shouldn't. Chapter 2: Fires of the East. Alexandria, 48 BC. The morning sun catches the lighthouse's marble like liquid gold, casting shadows across a harbor already thick with merchant ships. Frankincense from Arabia mingles with cedar from Lebanon. Persian silk rustles in the breeze. This is where East meets West, where the ancient world's greatest fortunes are made and lost. And somewhere in the royal palace, a 21-year-old woman is about to change everything. Her name is Cleopatra, and most people think they know her story. The seductress, the beauty who enslaved Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with her charms. But here's what the Roman historians didn't want you to know. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages fluently. She was educated at the great library of Alexandria, studying mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant, and that made her dangerous. More dangerous than Rome ever wanted to admit to its people. Picture this scene: the royal quarters at dawn. Cleopatra stands on her private balcony, watching the Nile flow past like liquid silver. She's wearing simple white linen, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In her hands, a letter from Rome. Caesar is dead, assassinated on the steps of the Senate. Everything she's built, her alliance, her protection, her kingdom's future, it's all just changed. The silence stretches. Then she calls for her advisors. Egypt, in Cleopatra's time, wasn't just wealthy, it was impossibly, almost mythically rich. The kingdom controlled the grain that fed Rome, the trade routes that connected Africa to Asia, the gold mines of Nubia, the papyrus that carried the ancient world's knowledge. When Roman senators wanted to impress their dinner guests, they served Egyptian wine, wore Egyptian linen, burned Egyptian incense. Egypt was luxury itself, and Cleopatra, she was Egypt. But power like this comes with a price. In the palace corridors, whispers follow her everywhere. Is she favoring her Greek courtiers over the native Egyptians? Can a woman really rule alone? Her younger brother Ptolemy XIV watches from the shadows, supported by advisors who believe a male pharaoh would be more manageable. Cleopatra knows these whispers. She's heard them since she was 18. She's learned to use them, turn them into weapons. The markets of Alexandria at midday. Imagine walking through them with her, the heat pressing down like a blanket. Vendors calling out in Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Arabic. The smell of cumin and coriander, dried fish and fresh bread. Cleopatra moves through this maze disguised, listening. This is how she governs, not from a throne room, but from the streets. She knows which merchants are struggling, which neighborhoods need attention. Her people whisper that their pharaoh has eyes everywhere. Here's something the history books skip over. Cleopatra wasn't just politically savvy, she was genuinely religious. Every morning she performed the ancient rituals to Isis, the goddess of motherhood and magic. She believed, truly believed, that she was the living incarnation of Isis on earth. This wasn't just royal propaganda. In her private moments lighting incense before the goddess's statue, she felt the weight of divine responsibility. Her kingdom wasn't just political, it was sacred. Then came the news that changed everything. Mark Antony, one of Rome's three ruling triumvirs, was coming to Egypt. Officially, he needed to discuss grain shipments. Unofficially, everyone knew he was broke. Rome's civil wars had drained his treasury. He needed Egypt's wealth, and Cleopatra knew it. This wasn't a diplomatic visit. This was an opportunity, maybe the most important opportunity of her life. She started planning immediately. Every detail would matter. Picture Cleopatra in her private chambers, surrounded by bolts of silk, samples of perfume, sketches of jewelry designs. She's not preparing for a party. She's preparing for war. A war fought with beauty, yes, but also with intelligence, wit, and careful political calculation. Her servants watch in fascination as their queen transforms herself into a living work of art, gold thread in her hair, kohl around her eyes, but it's her mind that's her real weapon. The day arrives. Antony waits on his galley in Alexandria's harbor, probably expecting another boring diplomatic meeting. Instead, a golden barge appears on the horizon. The sails are purple silk, the oars are silver. Musicians play on deck while incense burns in golden braziers. And there, reclining under a canopy, dressed as Aphrodite, goddess of love, is Cleopatra. Even Antony's battle-hardened soldiers stop what they're doing to stare. The queen has made her entrance. That first dinner together. Antony thought he was the one in control, the Roman general summoning an Egyptian queen to account for her kingdom's policies. But Cleopatra had turned his invitation into theater. The dining hall glowed with thousands of oil lamps. Rose petals carpeted the floor, ankle deep. Every dish was seasoned with spices worth more than a Roman soldier's yearly salary. Antony was overwhelmed, enchanted, and Cleopatra was just getting started. She had 3 more courses planned. What happened next wasn't just romance, it was a collision between 2 worlds. Antony represented Rome, disciplined, military, practical. Cleopatra embodied Egypt, ancient, mystical, impossibly sophisticated. When they spoke, she switched effortlessly between languages, discussing philosophy one moment, trade routes the next. Antony had conquered Gaul, fought in epic battles, but he'd never met anyone like this. A woman who could match his political ambition with her own intellectual brilliance. The nights they spent together weren't just about passion, they were planning sessions, maps spread across silk sheets, letters drafted by lamplight. Together, they began to envision something unprecedented, an empire that stretched from Spain to India, combining Rome's military might with Egypt's wealth and wisdom. They would rule together, equals, partners. It was ambitious beyond imagination. It was also, they both knew, completely impossible. Rome would never accept an Egyptian queen. But for now, in Alexandria's golden evenings, anything seemed possible. They sailed the Nile together, visiting temples older than Rome itself. Antony watched Cleopatra perform the ancient rituals, saw how her people genuinely loved her. This wasn't the decadent foreign queen Roman propaganda described. This was a brilliant ruler who spoke to farmers in Egyptian and to scholars in Greek, who knew every trade route and every prayer, who had turned survival into an art form. Meanwhile, in Rome, Octavian was watching. Caesar's heir, cold and calculating, he understood exactly what was happening in Alexandria. Antony wasn't just having an affair, he was being seduced away from Roman values, Roman discipline, Roman destiny. Letters arrived daily with reports of Antony adopting Egyptian customs, wearing Egyptian clothes. Octavian smiled grimly. His rival was handing him the perfect weapon. All he had to do was wait for the right moment to use it. As winter settled over Alexandria, Cleopatra stood once again on her balcony, watching the Nile flow past in the moonlight. But everything had changed. Antony slept beside her, his Roman armor abandoned for Egyptian silk. 3 children played in the palace gardens. Their children, the future she'd dreamed of, was becoming real. But across the Mediterranean, Roman senators whispered of treason. The propaganda war had begun, and neither she nor Antony understood yet that they had already lost. Chapter 3: The Crossing Paths. Tarsus, 41 BCE. The river runs black under moonlight, carrying whispers of what's about to unfold. Mark Antony waits on the marble steps of the harbor, his hands restless against stone, still warm from the day's heat. He doesn't know it yet, but this night will rewrite the fate of Rome. The air smells of jasmine and salt, of possibility, of danger. Somewhere across the water, golden sails catch starlight. She arrives like something from a dream. Cleopatra's barge cuts through the darkness, its prow carved into the shape of Aphrodite herself. Golden lanterns sway with each gentle wave, casting ripples of light across the water's surface. The oars move in perfect silence, No splash, no creak of wood, just the soft sound of water parting. Antony feels his breath catch. This isn't the diplomatic meeting he expected. This is theater. This is seduction made manifest. The barge glides closer, and details emerge from shadow. Purple silk drapes flutter in the night breeze. The scent of myrrh drifts across the water, mixed with something else. Cinnamon, maybe cardamom. Antony has conquered cities, commanded legions, but standing here, he feels like a boy again, uncertain. The marble beneath his sandals seems to shift. Around him, his guards watch in silence. Their usual chatter died to nothing. Even they sense it. The world is about to change. The gangplank touches stone with barely a sound. Then, she appears. Not the political alliance he expected, but Cleopatra as Isis herself. Her skin catches moonlight like polished bronze. Gold thread weaves through dark hair that moves with each step, but it's her eyes that stop him cold. They hold the weight of pyramids, the depth of the Nile. She's 28 years old and carries the soul of ancient Egypt in her gaze. Antony forgets to breathe. Their first words are lost to history, but the silence before speaks volumes. She pauses 3 steps from the bottom of the gangplank. He stands perfectly still on the marble. Between them, the space thrums with something neither expected. This was supposed to be politics, a meeting of convenience. Instead, the air itself seems charged. A night bird calls from somewhere in the cypress trees. The sound hangs there, lonely and wild, before fading into the gentle lap of water against stone. When she finally speaks, her voice carries the music of the Nile Delta, low, warm, with an accent that turns Latin words into something almost like song. She calls him Marcus, not Mark, not General, but the name his mother used. How does she know? How does she make it sound like a prayer? Antony feels the ground shift beneath him. Every conquest, every triumph, all of it suddenly feels like preparation for this moment, this woman, this impossible night in Tarsus. She moves with the fluid grace of someone born to command. But there's something else, a vulnerability that flickers behind her eyes for just an instant. She's not just Egypt's queen tonight. She's a woman far from home, gambling everything on this meeting. Her kingdom hangs in the balance. Rome's future rests on these next few hours. The weight of it shows in the careful way she places each sandaled foot on the marble. They both know the stakes. The empire itself holds its breath. The breeze picks up, carrying the scent of her perfume, something exotic that makes his head swim. Lotus blossoms mixed with frankincense, the kind of fragrance that haunts dreams long after you wake. She extends her hand, and when their skin touches, the world narrows to that single point of contact. Warm, electric. Her palm is softer than silk, but her grip speaks of strength, of a woman who's held the reins of power since she was 18 years old. Antony's world tilts. They walk together toward the villa, their footsteps echoing off marble columns. The servants melt away like shadows, leaving them in a cocoon of privacy. Above, stars wheel across the sky, the same constellations that watched over Alexander, over Caesar, over all the great loves and betrayals of history. Neither speaks. The silence between them pulses with possibility. Their shoulders almost touch. Almost. The space between feels electric, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, when the air itself trembles with anticipation. In the villa's garden, oil lamps flicker in their bronze holders. The light catches the gold threads in her dress, making her seem to glow from within. She pauses beside a fountain where water trickles over carved dolphins. The sound is hypnotic, gentle, constant, soothing, like the voice of the earth itself. She trails her fingers in the cool water, and droplets catch the lamplight like scattered diamonds. Antony watches, mesmerized. Has anyone ever made such a simple gesture seem like pure magic? The conversation that follows is like a dance, words chosen carefully, meanings layered beneath meanings. She speaks of trade routes and tribute. He mentions troop movements and supply lines. But beneath the diplomatic language, something else flows: attraction, recognition, the sense that they've found their match in ways that go far beyond politics. She laughs at something he says, and the sound is like silver bells in the night air. Antony realizes he's in trouble. The best kind of trouble. Hours pass like minutes. The moon traces its arc across star-drunk sky while they talk about everything, about nothing. She tells him stories of Alexandria, of the Great Library, of scholars who map the movements of planets. He shares tales of Gaul, of battles fought in morning mist, of the weight of command. Gradually, the careful distance between them closes. Their hands rest on the fountain's marble rim, inches apart. The space between thrums with electricity, with inevitability, with the pull of destiny. When she looks at him, really looks at him, Antony feels stripped bare, not by lust, though that's there too, but by understanding. She sees past the general, past the politician, straight to the man beneath, the one who's tired of war, who dreams of something more than conquest, who's been searching without knowing what he sought. Her eyes hold compassion along with desire, recognition, as if she's saying, "Here you are. Finally, I've been waiting. The universe has been waiting for this moment. For us." The night air grows cool around them, but neither notices. They're lost in a bubble of their own making, a world where only they exist. Her laughter mingles with his deeper chuckle. Their voices drop to whispers as they lean closer together. The fountain's gentle splash provides a backdrop to words that will never make it into the history books. Private words, intimate words, the kind that bind souls together and topple empires. Rome feels very far away right now. Alexandria might as well be another world. As dawn approaches, painting the eastern sky pale rose, they both know everything has changed. This wasn't supposed to happen. A meeting of allies, nothing more. But the heart recognizes no boundaries of nations or politics. What began as diplomacy has become something far more dangerous, far more precious. They stand slowly, reluctant to break the spell, to return to being queen and general instead of simply woman and man. The first birds begin their morning songs. Reality waits just beyond the garden walls. She boards her barge as the sun breaks free of the horizon. But everything has changed now. The careful distance of diplomacy has collapsed into something much more intimate, much more dangerous. Antony watches her golden sails disappear around the river's bend, but part of him goes with her, part of him always will. What happened in Tarsus, what crossed between them in those charged midnight hours, will reshape the ancient world. Their love story has just begun, and Rome will never recover. Chapter 4, Dance of Destiny. The summer of 41 BC brought more than just scorching winds across Alexandria. It brought Mark Antony to Cleopatra's palace, and everything changed, not just for them, but for Rome itself. They met as political allies, two rulers carving up the Mediterranean between them. But when evening fell and the palace grew quiet, when servants retreated and advisors disappeared, something else entirely began to unfold in those marble halls. Picture this: Antony, used to Roman efficiency and stark military camps, suddenly finding himself in a world where every surface gleamed with gold, where incense drifted through corridors like invisible rivers. Cleopatra understood the power of atmosphere. She knew that to capture a Roman general's attention, you didn't just speak to his ambition, you spoke to every one of his senses. The palace itself became her first seduction. Their first real conversation happened at sunset on a terrace overlooking the harbor. Antony expected to discuss grain shipments and troop movements. Instead, Cleopatra asked him about his dreams, not his political dreams, his sleeping ones. She told him hers too, how she dreamed sometimes of being a simple woman walking through markets without guards. How strange it was, she said, to rule millions but never truly know a single soul. What drew them together wasn't just power or convenience, it was recognition. Here was someone else who carried the weight of impossible expectations, someone who understood what it meant to smile at enemies during the day, then collapse in private chambers at night, wondering if tomorrow would bring another betrayal. They saw the loneliness in each other's eyes before they saw anything else. The African heat that summer was relentless. Even at midnight, the air hung heavy and still. But in the palace gardens, fountains created pockets of coolness. Cleopatra would walk there barefoot after midnight, her silk robes trailing through pools of water. One night, Antony found her there. They didn't speak at first, just stood listening to water cascading over marble in the darkness. Their partnership began with shared meals that stretched long into the night. Cleopatra introduced him to Egyptian wines aged in underground chambers. Antony taught her Roman drinking songs, his voice rough from years of commanding legions. They discovered they both loved stories, not the sanitized versions historians would write, but the messy human truth of how power actually works, how it changes you. The moment everything shifted, Antony was reviewing maps in his chambers when Cleopatra entered unannounced. She'd been crying, not the calculated tears of a politician, but real ones. Her brother's faction had attempted another coup. She'd had to order executions, people she'd known since childhood. Antony set down his stylus and simply held her. Two rulers, allowing themselves to be human for once. Their relationship became a dance between public performance and private truth. In council meetings, they addressed each other formally, Queen Cleopatra, General Antony, but their eyes would meet across the room, carrying conversations no one else could hear. A slight nod, a barely visible smile. They were writing a language only they understood, right in front of their advisors and enemies. Late one evening, musicians played in the courtyard below while they sat on her balcony. The moon was full, turning the Nile silver in the distance. Cleopatra asked if he ever missed Rome. Antony was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said Rome felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else. Here, watching her listen to music, he felt awake for the first time in years. Their strategic minds never stopped working, even in moments of tenderness. Lying together in her chambers, they traced maps on each other's skin, his finger following trade routes across her shoulder, her hand marking legion positions on his chest. Love and war intertwined so completely that neither could tell where one ended and the other began. This was their kind of intimacy. The servants noticed changes. Antony's harsh Roman discipline softened. He started asking about their families, learning their names. Cleopatra laughed more, not the practiced laughter of court ceremonies, but something genuine and unguarded. The palace felt different, still grand, still powerful, but somehow more human. Love was changing the atmosphere itself, one small gesture at a time. They would spend hours debating philosophy, politics, poetry, their voices growing animated as the night deepened. Antony discovered that Cleopatra spoke 9 languages fluently. She learned that beneath his warrior exterior, he quoted Virgil from memory. They were each other's intellectual match in ways neither had experienced before. Here was someone who could challenge them and understand the challenge in return. One particular night in late summer, they danced. Not the formal court dances with predetermined steps and watching crowds. They danced alone in her private chambers, to music only they could hear. Antony's rough soldier's hands learned the graceful movements she taught him. Their shadows moved across marble walls like ancient paintings come to life. This was their rebellion against duty. But even paradise carried shadows. Messages arrived daily from Rome, growing more urgent and more threatening. Octavian was consolidating power, spreading rumors about Antony's loyalty. The lovers knew their time was borrowed, that every sunset might be their last together. This knowledge made their whispered conversations more precious, their stolen moments more intense. They loved against the countdown of history. Their greatest strength was also their greatest vulnerability. They understood each other so completely that they began thinking as one person, making decisions together, finishing each other's sentences, moving through the palace like dancers who'd rehearsed the same routine for decades. But this unity would eventually become their downfall. Rome needed scapegoats, and lovers made perfect targets. As autumn approached, they made a choice that would echo through history. They would face whatever came together, not as the Roman general and the Egyptian queen, but as Mark and Cleopatra, 2 people who'd found something real in a world built on illusions. They sealed this promise not with documents or ceremonies, but with whispered words in the Egyptian darkness, words that still somehow linger in the ancient air. Chapter 5: Echoes of Prophecy. Alexandria's morning air carries the scent of lotus blossoms and incense as Cleopatra places her hand on her growing belly. Twin hearts beat beneath her ribs. The palace physicians whisper among themselves, 2 children, conceived in passion, now stirring questions that reach far beyond the bedroom walls. In Egypt, twins carry weight. They speak of balance, of duality, of futures written in stars. The temple of Isis stands silent in the pre-dawn darkness. High Priest Keti spreads sacred bones across marble, his weathered hands trembling slightly. The oracle speaks tonight. Cleopatra watches from the shadows, her silk robes rustling against stone columns. These children she carries, they're more than heirs. The gods have plans, and in Egypt, divine plans always demand a price that mortals struggle to understand. Antony paces the palace courtyard, his sandals clicking against polished limestone. News from Rome grows darker each day. Octavian's propaganda machine works overtime, painting him as Egypt's puppet, Cleopatra as Rome's destroyer. But here, in this moment, feeling his children move beneath his lover's skin, politics feels distant. The twins kick, he smiles. Some victories are measured in heartbeats, not battles. The oracle's voice echoes through the temple chamber, ancient words flowing like honey over stone. 2 souls, one destiny. The children of East and West shall bridge what men would tear apart. Cleopatra's breath catches. She understands Egyptian prophecy, its layers, its hidden meanings. These twins represent something bigger than bloodline. They carry the weight of 2 civilizations in their tiny forming bones. Letters arrive from Rome like poison-tipped arrows. Senators speak of corruption, of Egyptian influence seeping into Roman veins. Octavian fans these flames deliberately. He knows the power of narrative, how fear spreads faster than truth. Antony's Roman soldiers grow restless. They signed up to serve Rome, not birth Egyptian princes. The twins haven't been born, yet already they're dividing an empire. Egyptian tradition demands careful attention to omens. Palace astronomers chart celestial movements, mapping star positions for the coming births. Two children, born under different constellations, might rule different worlds. Cleopatra studies their calculations by lamplight, her eyes tracing mathematical predictions across papyrus. The future feels heavy, pregnant with possibility and catastrophe in equal measure. Some knowledge hurts to possess. In Rome's forum, Octavian addresses gathered crowds. His voice carries practiced emotion as he speaks of Roman blood polluted by foreign influence. Antony has forgotten his duty, he declares. He serves Egyptian gods now. The people murmur approval. They don't know about the twins yet, but when they do, Octavian will use even unborn children as weapons. Politics devours everything, even innocence. Cleopatra dreams of water, rivers flowing backward, flooding temples, carrying away golden statues. She wakes gasping, hand pressed to her belly. The twins move restlessly, as if they sense her fear. Egyptian dream interpretation runs deep in royal blood. Water means change. Backwards flow means reversal of fortune. The children stir again, and she wonders if they're trying to warn her or comfort her. Antony's Roman officers gather in hushed groups, their loyalty fraying like old rope. They watch their commander's transformation, how he adopts Egyptian customs, speaks of destiny instead of strategy. Some desert in the night, heading back to Italy, and Octavian's promise of redemption. Those who remain do so from love, not duty. Love makes the most dangerous foundation for any army. The prophecy spreads through Alexandria's markets like smoke. Merchants whisper about the royal twins, how they'll unite two worlds or destroy both trying. Common people understand power's price better than nobles. They've seen kingdoms rise and fall, watched as personal desires reshape entire civilizations. Some pack their belongings quietly, others make offerings at temple altars. Everyone prepares for change. Late at night, Cleopatra and Antony walk the palace gardens. Palm fronds rustle overhead, while fountain water trickles into marble basins. They talk about names, Marcus and Cleopatra, honoring both their heritages. But beneath casual conversation lurks deeper fear. These children will inherit a world at war. Their very existence challenges Rome's deepest prejudices. Love creates beautiful complications. Egyptian priests perform purification rituals, preparing sacred spaces for royal births. Incense smoke carries prayers to goddess Isis, protector of mothers and children. Ancient traditions demand respect for new life, but these aren't ordinary children. They carry Roman and Egyptian blood, making them bridges between hostile worlds. The priests understand history's weight. Some bridges support traffic, others collapse under pressure. Reports reach Alexandria about Roman troop movements. Octavian consolidates power, while Antony focuses on personal matters. The military imbalance grows daily. Experienced commanders shake their heads. Wars aren't won by love or prophecy, but by steel and strategy. Yet Antony remains confident. He believes destiny favors them. The twins will be symbols of unity. History suggests otherwise. Cleopatra feels the first strong kicks, powerful movements that make her gasp and smile simultaneously. These children possess their father's strength, their mother's determination. Palace servants notice her changing walk, the way she unconsciously protects her belly. Queens rarely show vulnerability, but pregnancy transforms everyone. Even goddesses become human when carrying life. The twins make her mortal and divine simultaneously. Autumn brings cooler winds and darker news from Rome. Octavian's propaganda reaches fever pitch, painting Antony as traitor, Cleopatra as destroyer of Roman virtue. The twins, still months from birth, already face a hostile world. Antony reads dispatch after dispatch, his face growing grimmer. Some battles begin before armies meet. This one started the moment love crossed political boundaries. As winter approaches, Alexandria prepares for royal births, while Rome prepares for war. The prophecy hangs between them like a sword, sharp with possibility, heavy with consequence. Cleopatra rests her hands on her belly, feeling two hearts beating against her ribs. These children carry impossible expectations. They're meant to bridge worlds that seem determined to tear apart. Love's greatest gift becomes history's heaviest burden. The Mediterranean in late summer carries a particular kind of restlessness. The water shifts from deep blue to silver to gold, depending on how the light hits it, and Marcus Antonius stands at the bow of his galley, watching those colors change. His hands grip the rails so tightly his knuckles have gone white. Behind him, Roman soldiers sharpen their swords and mend their armor. Ahead lies Alexandria. Between them, the most impossible choice a man can face. 3 days out from Brundisium, and the salt spray has dried on his face, like tears he won't let himself shed. Antony's captains speak in hushed tones about strategy, about supplies, about the wind, but he hears only the sound of waves against the hull, each one pulling him farther from duty, closer to desire. Rome expects him to return. Cleopatra expects him to stay. And somewhere between those expectations, Mark Antony is drowning. The irony isn't lost on him. Here he is, Marcus Antonius, conqueror of Parthia, master of the eastern territories, a man who once made kings kneel, and he's been reduced to pacing the deck of a ship like some lovesick boy. Every Roman aboard this vessel knows where they're headed, back to Egypt, back to her. None of them dare say what they're all thinking, that this journey marks the end of everything they once called honor. The letters from Octavian arrived 3 weeks ago in Alexandria, sealed with red wax and heavy with ultimatums. Antony read them once, folded them carefully, then watched the papyrus curl and blacken in the flame of a single oil lamp. But the words burned themselves into memory anyway. Return to Rome immediately. Abandon your Egyptian entanglements. Remember your duty to the Republic, as if duty were something you could simply remember your way back into. Cleopatra never asked him to choose. That's the part that cuts deepest. She simply stood in the doorway of her chambers, wrapped in linen the color of morning light, and said nothing at all. Her silence spoke louder than any plea. She knew, had always known, that love and power make dangerous companions, that when they're forced to compete, only one can survive. And now, somewhere in the space between Alexandria's harbor and Rome's marble steps, that competition has begun. The wind picks up as evening settles over the water, and Antony finds himself remembering the first time he saw her. Not the golden barge that Roman poets love to describe, but later that same night, in her private quarters, when the crown was set aside and she was just a woman, brilliant and fierce and impossibly real. Rome had given him titles, territories, the respect of legions, but Cleopatra had given him something else entirely, something he hadn't even known he was missing. His reflection wavers in the dark water below, fractured by the ship's wake. Antony studies that broken image and wonders if this is how history will remember him, scattered across the waves, pulled in too many directions to hold any recognizable shape. The Roman half of him knows exactly what honor demands. Return home, submit to the Senate's will, accept whatever punishment Octavian deems fit. But the man who has tasted Egyptian wine from Cleopatra's cup, that man knows different truths entirely. Dawn brings no clarity, only a horizon that seems to stretch infinitely in both directions, east toward Alexandria, west toward Rome. Antony's officers approach with the day's reports, and he nods at the appropriate moments, makes the necessary decisions about course and speed and provisions. But part of him is still standing in that palace garden, watching Cleopatra teach their children to speak Latin. Caesarion's voice mixing with Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, a sound more precious than any victory horn. The thing about crossing the Mediterranean is how it gives you too much time to think, too much time to weigh duty against desire, responsibility against love. Antony has made this journey dozens of times, but never like this. Never with the weight of choosing between two worlds pressing down on his shoulders. Each league traveled feels like a small betrayal of someone he simply can't decide who deserves his loyalty more. Rome, which made him, or Egypt, which remade him. A storm gathers on the third night, and Antony takes it as an omen, the kind of Mediterranean tempest that can swallow ships whole, leaving nothing but scattered wood and silence. His crew works frantically to secure the rigging, but Antony remains on deck, letting the rain soak through his cloak. There's something honest about weather this violent, something that matches the chaos inside his chest. For hours, nature mirrors exactly how it feels to love someone the world insists you shouldn't. When dawn finally breaks through the storm clouds, Antony sees land on the horizon, Egypt. The lighthouse at Alexandria, rising like a finger pointing toward heaven, or perhaps toward damnation. Either way, it feels like home, and that recognition settles something fundamental in his bones. Rome had his birth, his youth, his military glory, but this place where Cleopatra waits with their children, this has his heart. And maybe, in the end, that's the only geography that matters. He thinks of his old friend Cicero's letters, full of warnings about Egyptian queens and their dangerous magic, how they bewitch Roman men, lead them astray from proper Roman virtue. But standing here, watching Alexandria's white walls catch the morning light, Antony understands that Cicero had it backwards. There's no magic involved, just a woman who sees him clearly, all of him, and loves what she finds there. That kind of acceptance is rarer than any spell, more powerful than any enchantment. The decision crystallizes as they enter the harbor. Not a moment of dramatic revelation, just a quiet certainty that settles over him like familiar clothing. Antony will not return to Rome, will not kneel before Octavian's growing power, will not pretend that duty matters more than the life he's built here, in this place where East meets West, and love is allowed to exist without apology. Some choices feel like endings. This one feels like the first real beginning he's known in years. As the ship slides into its berth, Antony can see her waiting on the dock. Cleopatra, dressed simply in white linen, her dark hair catching the breeze. No crown today, no ceremony or spectacle, just a woman welcoming home the man she loves. Behind her, Their children wait in the shade of date palms, and for a moment, this looks like any family reunion in any port city across the Mediterranean. Except this reunion will change the course of history. Sometimes love does that. He steps onto Egyptian soil for what he somehow knows will be the final time as a Roman general. Tomorrow, he'll be something else, something harder to define. A man who chose love over empire, personal truth over public duty. History will judge him harshly for this moment. He knows. Roman historians will paint him as weak, corrupted, a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign influence. But standing here, breathing the familiar scent of Alexandria's spices and salt air, Antony finds he doesn't care. Cleopatra reaches him first, and when their hands touch, the last of his doubt dissolves like salt in seawater. This, this is where he belongs. Not in the forum's marble halls or the Senate's endless debates, but here, with this brilliant woman who understands power and uses it to protect what matters most: love, family, the future they're building together. The Mediterranean waves lap against the harbor wall, and Antony realizes the sundering sea has done its work. It has finally carried him home. Chapter 7: The Unraveling Threads. By the summer of 32 BC, something had shifted in Rome's marble corridors. The air itself felt different, heavier somehow. Senators walked more quietly through the forum. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Octavian had begun his most dangerous game yet, a careful dismantling of everything Antony represented. Not with swords, not yet, with whispers that spread like wine stains through white cloth. Irreversible, permanent, the kind of damage that seeps deep into the very foundations of a man's legacy and reputation. Letters arrived in Alexandria almost daily now. Reports from Roman allies, warnings from friends still loyal to Antony's cause. The message was always the same. Octavian was building something, a case against them. Public opinion was a battlefield, and Rome's future heir had claimed the high ground early. He understood what Antony never quite grasped, that in politics truth matters less than timing, and the story people choose to believe. Cleopatra read these dispatches in her private chambers, oil lamps casting dancing shadows across papyrus. The net was tightening. Octavian's genius lay not in what he said about his rival, but how he said it. Never direct accusations that would seem crude, desperate. Instead, he planted seeds. Casual observations about foreign influences, concerns about Roman traditions being forgotten, questions about where true loyalty resided. His supporters spread these ideas through the city like merchants hawking exotic spices. By winter, Romans who had never met Cleopatra spoke of her as if she personally threatened their children. This was propaganda at its most artful, invisible, inevitable, absolutely devastating in its quiet precision. The Senate meetings that autumn carried an electric tension. Men who had once called Antony friend now avoided his name entirely. Others defended him with the careful words of politicians, sensing which way the wind was turning. Octavian attended these sessions regularly, always respectful, always measured. He never needed to attack directly. His mere presence reminded everyone of the choice they would soon face. Rome's future hung between two visions, one familiar, one foreign, one traditionally Roman, one dangerously exotic. The unspoken question filled every silence. Which side would survive the coming storm? In Alexandria's royal quarters, Antony paced marble floors worn smooth by generations of Ptolemaic rulers. His advisors brought news from Rome that grew darker each month. Former allies remained silent when his name was mentioned. Old debts of loyalty seemed suddenly forgotten. The man who had once commanded the devotion of entire legions found himself increasingly isolated, not by distance alone, but by the careful construction of narrative. Octavian was rewriting history before it had even finished unfolding, and Antony was beginning to understand just how masterfully he had been outmaneuvered in this deadly game. The propaganda war reached into every corner of Roman life. Poets suddenly discovered inspiration in stories of foreign seduction. Playwrights crafted scenes of noble Romans, led astray by Eastern enchantment. Even common merchants in the marketplace echoed themes they had heard in taverns, whispered concerns about Roman virtue, compromised by Egyptian gold. This wasn't accidental. Octavian's agents understood that the most powerful lies contain fragments of truth. Antony was indeed in Egypt. He was indeed changed by his time there. These facts became the foundation for a much larger, much more dangerous fiction. Cleopatra watched this campaign unfold with the calculating mind of a queen who had survived palace coups and foreign invasions. She understood power, how it flowed, where it pooled, when it shifted. What impressed her most about Octavian's strategy was its patience. He wasn't rushing toward open conflict. Instead, he was making that conflict inevitable while ensuring he would be seen as its reluctant participant, the righteous defender of Roman tradition, the young leader forced to save his people from foreign manipulation. Brilliant, terrifying, almost certainly effective against any opponent except perhaps her. The Whisper campaign grew more sophisticated as months passed. Stories circulated about Antony abandoning Roman customs entirely, claims that he now dressed as a pharaoh, reports of strange Eastern rituals performed in Alexandria's palace. Some of these stories contained kernels of truth. Antony had indeed adopted certain Egyptian practices, but truth and propaganda are different creatures entirely. Octavian's supporters transformed cultural adaptation into cultural betrayal. They painted love as enslavement. They made curiosity about foreign ways seem like treason against everything Rome held sacred. The transformation was masterful and merciless. By early 31 BC, the atmosphere in Rome felt almost ceremonial, like the final preparations before a religious festival. Everyone knew what was coming. War was inevitable now. But this war would be different from Rome's typical campaigns. This would be framed as a rescue mission. Romans weren't attacking Egypt, they were saving their own general from foreign enchantment. They weren't invading, they were liberating. Octavian had constructed the perfect narrative. Win or lose, he would be Rome's righteous defender. Antony, meanwhile, found himself cast as the villain in his own story. The most insidious aspect of Octavian's strategy was how it made defending Antony seem almost treasonous. Anyone who spoke too favorably of Rome's eastern general risked being viewed with suspicion themselves. Were they also compromised by foreign influence? Had Egyptian gold bought their loyalty too? This atmosphere of suspicion created its own momentum. Silence became safer than support. Neutrality felt more patriotic than loyalty. Former allies melted away, not from personal betrayal, but from political survival. Octavian had weaponized fear itself, and fear, once released, spreads like plague through any community. In Alexandria's harbor, Egyptian ships gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. Cleopatra was preparing for what seemed inevitable, a final confrontation that would determine the fate of both their kingdoms. She understood the stakes better than perhaps anyone. This wasn't just about love or politics anymore. This was about survival. Rome would not tolerate a truly independent Egypt. They never had. Her relationship with Antony had simply given Octavian the excuse he needed to finish what Julius Caesar had started decades earlier, the annexation of the last great Hellenistic kingdom. History was reaching its conclusion. Antony's supporters in Rome faced an impossible choice: remain loyal and risk being branded as traitors to Roman tradition, or abandon their old commander and watch him face his enemies alone. Most chose a third option: careful silence that preserved their own positions while avoiding direct betrayal. This middle path felt honorable to men who had once shared wine and victories with Antony. But silence in times of crisis becomes its own form of abandonment. Each day without public support made Antony appear more isolated, more foreign, more dangerous to Rome's future. The cumulative effect was devastating. The final months of 31 BC carried an almost dreamlike quality. Everyone knew war was coming, but daily life continued with surprising normalcy. Romans went to the theater, they shopped in markets, they celebrated religious festivals. Yet underneath this routine existence, the city hummed with anticipation. Octavian's supporters prepared for what they called liberation. Antony's remaining allies prepared for what felt like apocalypse. And in Alexandria, two lovers prepared for a battle that would determine whether their vision of the future could survive contact with Rome's traditional expectations. What made Octavian's campaign so effective was how it made even Antony's greatest accomplishments seem suspicious. His military victories in the East, weren't those just opportunities for foreign corruption? His administrative skills in governing Roman territories, hadn't those territories changed him more than he changed them? His political alliance with Cleopatra, wasn't that just enslavement disguised as partnership? Every strength became a weakness. Every achievement became evidence of compromise. This rhetorical alchemy transformed Rome's most successful general into its most dangerous threat. The reframing was complete and probably irreversible. By midsummer of 31, Octavian had achieved something remarkable. He had made war seem not just inevitable, but righteous. Romans weren't choosing sides in a civil conflict anymore. They were choosing between Rome and Egypt, between tradition and decadence, between freedom and foreign domination. The propaganda campaign had transformed a political rivalry into a moral crusade. Antony found himself defending not just his actions, but his entire identity as a Roman. Cleopatra watched her beloved forced to prove his loyalty to people who had already decided he was lost. The trial had begun before the battle, as autumn winds began stirring dust in Alexandria's streets. Both lovers understood their time was ending, not their love that burned as fiercely as ever, but their time as rulers of separate worlds that might somehow coexist. Rome had chosen its path. Octavian had made certain of that. What remained now was the final test: whether love could survive the collision between empires, whether two people who had found something beautiful together could protect it from a world determined to see it destroyed. The threads were unraveling. Soon, only the strongest bonds would remain intact. September 2nd, 31 BC. The waters off Actium shimmer under an unforgiving sun. Two massive fleets face each other across the narrow strait. Antony's ships heavy with Egyptian gold, their hulls creaking under the weight of ambition. Octavian's vessels sleeker, built for speed rather than spectacle. The morning air tastes of salt and something else, the metallic tang of approaching violence. Both commanders know this single day will reshape the known world. For months, they'd been circling each other like wolves. Antony's camp on the southern shore, watching Octavian's forces gather across the water, supply lines stretched thin, men growing restless, disease creeping through the ranks, the kind that comes when armies wait too long in one place. Cleopatra's advisors whisper about retreat, but Antony's pride burns too bright. He's committed now, all or nothing on these September waters. Dawn breaks gray and humid. Antony stands on his flagship's deck, studying Octavian's battle line through the haze, 230 ships against his 400. The numbers should favor him, but something feels wrong. His captains avoid his eyes. Too many empty benches where rowers should sit. Too many ships riding high in the water, lighter than they should be. Desertion has been bleeding his force dry for weeks. Cleopatra's 60 ships form their own squadron, golden prows catching the early light. She wears her armor like jewelry, polished bronze that gleams with every movement. Her presence here isn't just symbolic. Egypt's treasury funds this war. Her grain feeds these soldiers. If Antony falls, she falls with him. The weight of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule rests on these next few hours. The first horn sounds across the water, long, mournful notes that echo off the distant hills. Octavian's ships begin their advance, disciplined, coordinated, moving like pieces on a game board. His admiral Marcus Agrippa knows these waters, has planned this moment for months. Every ship knows its position, every captain his role. This is Roman efficiency at its deadliest. Antony's response comes scattered, uncertain. His massive quinqueremes lumber forward, towers of wood and bronze meant to intimidate. But intimidation only works when your enemy fears you. Octavian's lighter ships dance around them like wasps around bears, striking, withdrawing, striking again. The sound of bronze rams hitting timber echoes across the strait like thunder. The battle becomes chaos. Ships lock together, soldiers fighting across narrow gaps between decks. The water turns red, not from sunset, but from blood seeping through shattered planks. Arrows whistle overhead. The air fills with smoke from burning pitch. Men scream in languages from across the Mediterranean. This is empire against empire, civilization tearing itself apart. Then something changes. Cleopatra's squadron breaks formation. Her golden ships turn south, heading for open water. Is this retreat or strategy? Antony watches from his flagship, his heart stopping as he realizes she's leaving. The woman he's risked everything for is abandoning the field. His officers shout questions he can't answer. The battle hangs in the balance. In that moment, Mark Antony makes a choice that will echo through history. He abandons his flagship, abandons his men, follows Cleopatra toward Egypt like a man possessed. His officers watch in stunned silence as their commander disappears over the horizon. The battle isn't lost yet, but their leader is gone. What do you do when the man you die for chooses love over honor? The remaining fleet fights on for hours, ships captained by men who still believe in the cause, or maybe just can't accept defeat. But without Antony, without unified command, they're just individual acts of courage against impossible odds. One by one, Octavian's captains isolate and capture or sink them. The water becomes a graveyard of splintered wood and broken dreams. By evening, it's over. Octavian stands on his flagship's deck, surveying the wreckage. Bodies float between burning ships. The silence feels unnatural after hours of combat, just the lap of waves against hulls, and the distant crying of seabirds. He's won more than a battle. He's won the future. Rome will have one master now. The Republic's final breath died here in these bloodied waters. News travels faster than fleeing ships. Before Antony and Cleopatra reach Alexandria, whispers spread through Egyptian ports. Defeat, disaster, the fleet destroyed, their protector fled. Merchants begin hoarding grain. Priests offer desperate sacrifices to gods who seem to have turned their faces away. The golden age of Ptolemaic Egypt feels suddenly fragile as morning mist. In Alexandria's palace, servants prepare for siege. They've heard the stories, what happens when Roman legions arrive at defeated cities. Cleopatra walks her gardens one last time, touching flowers that may not bloom again under Roman rule. The library's scrolls, the lighthouse's beacon, all of it suddenly feels temporary, like sand sculptures before a rising tide. Antony paces his chambers like a caged animal. The man who once commanded legions across 3 continents now commands nothing but his own regret. Every reflection shows him the moment he chose love over duty, his officers' faces as he sailed away, the battle he might have won if he'd stayed. Glory traded for a woman's company. History will not be kind to this choice. Octavian's ships appear on the horizon 3 months later, black sails against the morning sun, carrying Rome's judgment toward Egypt's shores. The citizens of Alexandria watch from their rooftops as destiny approaches. Some flee inland, others prepare to surrender. A few sharpen hidden knives, choosing their own end rather than Roman chains. The age of pharaohs dies with the dawn. The Battle of Actium changed everything, not just who ruled Rome, but how power itself would flow for centuries. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of an empire that would stretch from Britain to Babylon. And in Alexandria, 2 lovers faced the final act of their tragedy. Their passion had moved armies, toppled governments, and reshaped the ancient world. Now comes the reckoning. The ships limped into Alexandria's harbor like wounded animals seeking shelter. Antony stood at the prow, watching his beloved Egypt grow larger with each stroke of the oars. But this homecoming felt different, hollow. The defeat at Actium clung to him like sea salt, bitter and persistent. Cleopatra's hand found his shoulder, her touch gentle but weary. Behind them, what remained of their combined fleets followed, a shadow of the force that had once challenged Rome itself. Alexandria had always been a city of marble and gold, where scholars debated philosophy in courtyards fragrant with jasmine. Now, even the morning light seemed dimmer somehow. Servants moved through the palace halls with hurried steps and downcast eyes. News of Octavian's victory had reached Egypt faster than their own return. The weight of defeat had settled over the kingdom like dust after a sandstorm, fine, pervasive, impossible to escape. Antony found himself standing in rooms he didn't remember entering. His mind wandered to battles fought, decisions made, moments when victory had seemed certain. The great Roman general who had once commanded legions now questioned every choice. His reflection in polished bronze showed a man aged beyond his years. Gray had crept into his beard. Lines mapped his face like territories conquered, and lost each one a reminder of what might have been. Cleopatra maintained her royal composure, but those closest to her noticed the changes. She spent hours staring from her chamber windows toward the harbor, as if willing different ships to appear on the horizon. Her advisors brought reports, Octavian's forces growing stronger, allies abandoning their cause, the net closing steadily around Egypt. Yet she wore her golden diadem each morning with the same dignity as always, a queen until the end. Their love, once fierce as desert winds, now carried the fragility of autumn leaves. They still reached for each other in the dark hours before dawn, but their embraces held desperation rather than passion. Conversations that once sparked with wit and strategy now fell into comfortable silences, not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the heavy stillness that comes when there are too many difficult truths left unspoken between two people who know each other's hearts. The royal court continued its rituals, banquets, ceremonies, the daily theater of power. But beneath the surface, everyone understood the performance was temporary. Nobles spoke in hushed tones about escape routes and hidden treasures. Some had already begun sending emissaries to Octavian, hedging their bets. The musicians still played their lyres each evening, but even the melodies seemed subdued, beautiful songs carrying the weight of an ending no one wanted to acknowledge. Reports arrived daily from the eastern territories, cities surrendering without siege, governors switching sides. The map of their empire, once painted in bold strokes across the Mediterranean, was shrinking like cloth in a flame. Each lost province brought Octavian closer to Egypt's borders. Cleopatra studied these reports by lamplight, her finger tracing routes that were no longer safe, harbors that no longer welcomed her ships, watching her world contract around them. There were still moments, brief and precious, when they found traces of who they used to be. Antony would catch Cleopatra laughing at something her son had said, and for an instant her face would light up with the same joy he'd fallen in love with years ago. She would find him reading scrolls in the library, lost in thought, and see the brilliant strategist rather than the defeated general. These glimpses kept them anchored to each other when everything else felt adrift. Wine had become Antony's frequent companion, not the celebratory drinking of victory feasts, but the slow, steady consumption of a man trying to quiet his thoughts. He sat in gardens where he'd once planned campaigns, cup in hand, watching shadows lengthen across marble statues. The Egyptian vintage tasted different now, or perhaps his palate had changed. Everything carried the bitter aftertaste of regret. Even the finest amphora couldn't wash away the taste of defeat. Cleopatra threw herself into the business of being queen with renewed intensity. She met with merchants about grain shipments, discussed temple renovations with architects, received ambassadors from distant kingdoms. Some days, the relentless focus almost worked, almost convinced her that normalcy was possible. But then a messenger would arrive with news from the West, and reality would crash back like waves against stone, persistent, erosive, unstoppable in its advance toward their shores. Their conversations had changed too, where once they debated strategy late into the night, now they spoke of smaller things, the taste of figs from a particular tree, memories of their children's first steps, stories from before they'd met. It was as if, sensing the approaching end of their grand story, they'd begun collecting the intimate details, the ordinary moments that had made their extraordinary love feel real and human and worth every sacrifice. The weight of failure settled differently on each of them. For Antony, it felt like armor he couldn't remove, heavy, constricting, a constant reminder of battles lost. For Cleopatra, it was more like water seeping through stone, gradual but relentless, finding every crack in her composure. Together, they carried the knowledge that their choices had consequences beyond themselves. Two kingdoms, millions of people, the entire balance of the known world, hanging in the wake of their defeat. Sometimes, in the hour between sunset and full darkness, They would find themselves on the palace roof, looking out over Alexandria's harbor. The city spread below them like scattered jewels, oil lamps beginning to flicker to life in windows. In these moments, standing close enough to feel each other's warmth, the old fire would kindle briefly between them, not the consuming passion of their early days, but something deeper, more tender, love refined by loss into its purest form. The harsh mathematics of their situation became clearer each day. Octavian controlled the seas. Their treasury, once seemingly endless, had limits. Allies were few and growing fewer. Even Egypt's legendary wealth couldn't buy what they needed most: time. The walls of Alexandria, though ancient and strong, couldn't hold back the tide of Roman ambition indefinitely. Every sunrise brought them closer to decisions no one wanted to make, but that circumstances were forcing upon them. Desperation began to show itself in small ways. Cleopatra's hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. Antony would start sentences and then forget what he'd meant to say. They made plans they both knew were impossible: escape routes to India, negotiations with Parthia, last-ditch military strategies. But beneath the planning lay a growing acceptance of something neither wanted to speak aloud: that their great love story was approaching its final chapters. As autumn deepened over Alexandria, a strange peace settled over the palace. Not the peace of victory or even of acceptance, but the quiet that comes when all possibilities have been considered and found wanting. They still loved each other, perhaps more purely than ever before, but love, they were learning, wasn't always enough to change the course of history. Sometimes it could only make the inevitable bearable and give meaning to what came after defeat. Chapter 10: A Broken Alliance. The palace at Alexandria felt different now. Empty corridors that once echoed with laughter now held only whispers and worried footsteps. Antony paced the marble floors, his hands trembling slightly as he unrolled another dispatch from Rome. Each message brought worse news. His allies had abandoned him one by one, like birds fleeing before a storm. The man who had once commanded half the world now found himself counting loyal friends on a single hand. Sleep had become a stranger to both lovers. Cleopatra would wake in the pre-dawn darkness, her silk sheets damp with sweat from dreams of Roman soldiers marching through her capital. In these nightmares, she saw her children in chains, her scrolls burning in the great library, her golden throne melted down for Octavian's treasury. She'd reach across the bed, seeking Antony's warmth, but even when he was there, he felt miles away, lost in his own torment. Antony's drinking had grown worse. The wine that once loosened his tongue at feasts now became his constant companion, a liquid shield against the reality closing around them. His officers watched helplessly as their commander stumbled through morning briefings, his once sharp military mind dulled by grief and alcohol. The great general who had conquered nations now couldn't conquer his own despair. His hands shook when he tried to write letters to remaining allies, the words blurring together. The palace servants moved like ghosts through hallways that had once buzzed with diplomatic energy. Foreign ambassadors no longer sought audiences with the queen. Trade ships bypassed Alexandria's harbor, fearing association with the doomed couple. Even the city's famous markets grew quiet, merchants whispering about what would happen when Rome finally came calling. The weight of impending doom settled over Egypt like dust after a sandstorm, coating everything in a fine layer of dread. Cleopatra tried to maintain her royal composure during public appearances, but those closest to her noticed the changes. Her golden jewelry seemed heavier now, dragging at her shoulders. Her carefully applied kohl couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. When she spoke to her remaining advisors, her voice carried a brittle edge it had never held before. The woman who had charmed both Caesar and Antony was learning what it meant to feel powerless for the first time in her life. Antony's attempts to rally his remaining forces grew increasingly desperate. He promised land, gold, glory, anything to keep his soldiers from deserting to Octavian's seemingly unstoppable army. But promises from a losing general carry little weight. Each dawn brought news of another defection, another city surrendering without a fight. The dominoes of his empire were falling, and he could only watch as 30 years of military achievements crumbled into dust and memory. In quieter moments, usually late at night, when the wine had numbed his racing thoughts, Antony would remember better times. Victory parades in Rome, the cheers of soldiers after hard-won battles, the respect in Caesar's eyes when he'd trusted him with crucial commands. Now those same Roman crowds would jeer his name. His statues had been torn down, his honors stripped away. He'd become everything he'd once fought against, a traitor to the republic he'd sworn to serve. Cleopatra's nightmares grew more vivid as the weeks passed. She'd dream of Octavian's triumph procession, seeing herself dragged through Roman streets in golden chains, while crowds threw refuse and shouted curses. In these dreams, her children aged and died in Roman cells while she watched helplessly. She'd wake gasping, her hands instinctively moving to her throat, where she could almost feel the executioner's rope. The proud queen of Egypt was learning what it meant to feel genuine fear. Their love, once a source of strength, now felt like a shared burden. When they looked at each other across the dining table, both saw their own doom reflected in the other's eyes. Their conversations, previously filled with plans for the future, now circled around desperate strategies with little hope of success. The passion that had once felt like destiny now seemed like the cruelest twist of fate, binding them together as their world collapsed around them. The palace library, once Cleopatra's sanctuary, had become a mausoleum of broken dreams. Scrolls containing carefully crafted alliances lay forgotten on dusty shelves. Maps marking Antony's territories were now historical artifacts, showing an empire that existed only in memory. The queen would wander these halls at dawn, running her fingers along papyrus documents that detailed a future that would never come to pass. Knowledge felt useless when there was no tomorrow to apply it to. Antony's officers began avoiding him, unable to bear watching their once great commanders decline. The man who had inspired fierce loyalty through charisma and tactical brilliance now raged at shadows and made decisions that bordered on madness. His famous temper, previously controlled and strategic, erupted at the smallest provocations. Servants learned to approach him carefully, like one might approach a wounded lion, still dangerous, but no longer truly powerful. The Mediterranean trade routes that had once enriched Alexandria now carried news of Octavian's approaching victory. Merchant ships brought stories of cities surrendering without siege, of Antony's former allies publicly denouncing their old loyalties. Each tale was another nail in the coffin of their resistance. Cleopatra's spies reported that even Egypt's own nobles were quietly making overtures to Rome, hedging their bets against the queen they'd served faithfully for 2 decades. In moments of clarity between wine and despair, Antony would remember his funeral preparations. Roman tradition demanded proper rites, but what tradition applied to a man who'd renounced Rome for love? His tomb would never stand in the Campus Martius alongside other great generals. His name would be carved in Egyptian stone in a land that would soon belong to his enemies. The irony wasn't lost on him. he'd live forever in the wrong empire. Cleopatra's children, still too young to understand the full scope of their danger, continued their lessons with patient tutors who wondered if knowledge of mathematics and rhetoric would matter in the Roman cells awaiting them. The queen watched her son play with toy soldiers, arranging them in battle formations that would never be tested in real warfare. Her daughter practiced royal etiquette for ceremonies that would never happen. Innocence felt like the cruelest luxury in their shrinking world. The winds off the Mediterranean carried different scents now. Where once they'd brought news of profitable trade and diplomatic victories, now they whispered of approaching armies and burning cities. Antony would stand on the palace balcony, breathing in air that tasted of endings. The sunset painted the sky the color of blood and gold, a fitting backdrop for an empire's final act. He wondered if Caesar's ghost watched from somewhere, disappointed in his former protege's choices. As this chapter of their story closes, we see two people who had once believed themselves invincible, learning the weight of mortality. Their broken alliance with Rome had become a broken alliance with hope itself. Yet even in their darkest hour, they clung to each other, finding in love the only territory that Octavian couldn't conquer. Tomorrow would bring new defeats, but tonight they still had each other, and sometimes that has to be enough. Alexandria felt different that morning. Heavy with secrets, Cleopatra stood before her silver mirror, studying her reflection one last time. Her advisors had argued against this plan, called it madness, but she knew Antony better than anyone. His pride, his honor, his terrible capacity for guilt. If he believed she was dead, if he thought he'd failed her completely, perhaps that shock would break through his despair. Perhaps it would bring him back to her. A dangerous gamble with the highest stakes. The plan required perfect timing. Cleopatra's most trusted servant, Apollodorus, would carry the message. He'd tell Antony that his queen had taken her own life, that she'd chosen death rather than capture by Octavian. The lie tasted bitter in her mouth, but love makes liars of us all. She dismissed her guards, sealed her chambers, and waited in the tomb she'd built for herself years earlier. The stone walls felt cold against her skin. Now, everything depended on Antony's reaction. Apollodorus found Antony in his quarters, staring at maps he no longer believed in. The servant's face was streaked with tears, real tears, because even staged grief requires genuine emotion. "My lord," he whispered, his voice breaking perfectly. "The queen, she is gone." She could not bear the thought of being paraded through Rome as Octavian's prize. She chose to join her ancestors. The words hit Antony like physical blows. His hands began to shake. The world tilted sideways. For a moment, Antony couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt too thin, like he was drowning on dry land. Cleopatra, dead, because of him, because he'd failed as a general, as a lover, as a man. She'd faced her final moments alone while he wallowed in defeat. The guilt crushed down on his chest like stones. He stumbled to the window, looking out at Alexandria, her city, their city, everything golden and beautiful, and now forever empty. What was the point of breathing in a world without her? Antony's reflection stared back from his bronze mirror. Older, grayer, marked by months of bitter defeats. This man had once commanded legions, had held the eastern half of the Roman world in his hands. But what good was power when the person you loved most was gone? His fingers traced the scars on his arms, souvenirs from a dozen campaigns. Battle wounds heal, but this wound would follow him to whatever came after death. If there was anything after death at all, His sword lay on the table where he'd abandoned it days ago. Roman steel, perfectly balanced, still sharp despite everything they'd been through together. Antony lifted it slowly, feeling its familiar weight. There was a kind of poetry in it, ending where Cleopatra had ended, following her across whatever boundary separates the living from the dead. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in months. Sometimes the hardest decision is also the simplest one. Sometimes love demands the ultimate sacrifice. The blade went in clean, just below his ribs. Antony had seen enough battlefield wounds to know exactly where to aim. He fell to his knees, then onto his side, watching his blood pool on the stone floor. It was darker than he'd expected, warmer. The pain came in waves, sharp at first, then strangely distant. He thought about Cleopatra's laugh, the way she'd tilt her head when she was thinking. Maybe death wouldn't be so bad if it meant seeing her again. That's when Apollodorus burst through the door. The servant's eyes went wide with horror, real horror this time, not the performed grief from earlier. My lord. No. She lives. The queen lives. But Antony was already fading, his vision blurring at the edges. What? He whispered. Apollodorus knelt beside him, tears streaming down his face. It was a ruse, my lord. She wanted to win you back. She's alive. She's alive and waiting for you. The cruelest words he'd ever heard. The irony cut deeper than any blade. Cleopatra's plan had worked perfectly and failed completely. Antony tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. Pink foam bubbled on his lips. Apollodorus was calling for help, screaming for physicians, but they both knew it was too late. The wound was mortal. Roman soldiers weren't trained to wound, only to kill. And Antony had been a very good soldier, even against himself, especially against himself. Love had made them both desperate. Desperation had made them both foolish. They carried him on a litter through Alexandria's streets, the same streets where he'd once ridden in triumph beside Cleopatra. Citizens lined the roads, some weeping, others silent with shock. Word had spread quickly. The great Mark Antony, dying because of a misunderstanding, because love and pride and desperation had tangled together like rope around their necks. His breathing was shallow now, rattling in his chest, but he was still conscious, still fighting. He had to see her one more time. Cleopatra waited in her tomb, surrounded by the golden treasures of 7 pharaohs. When they brought Antony to her, she didn't cry. Queens don't cry, at least not where others can see them. But her hands shook as she knelt beside his litter. He looked so pale, so different from the robust general who'd swept her off her feet all those years ago. My love, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My beautiful fool, what have we done to each other? Antony's eyes found hers, still that impossible blue-green she'd fallen in love with. Did we ever have a chance, he asked, each word costing him. Cleopatra touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that war and worry had carved there. We had 13 years, she said. 13 years of something the world had never seen before. Something they'll remember for 1,000 years after we're gone. Maybe that's enough. But her voice cracked on the last word. They didn't speak much after that. There wasn't time, and besides, some things don't need words. Cleopatra held his hand while his breathing grew more labored. She told him about their children, safe in hiding, about the sunrise that morning, how it had painted the harbor gold. Small things, beautiful things, the kind of details that make life worth living. Antony smiled at her voice, even as his vision dimmed. Promise me, he started to say, then stopped. Some promises are too heavy for the dying. When it was over, Cleopatra sat in the silence for a long time. The torch flames danced on the tomb walls, casting shadows that moved like spirits. She'd gambled everything on love and lost, but maybe Antony was right to ask if they'd ever had a chance. Rome was too big, too hungry, too afraid of what they represented together. A Roman general and an Egyptian queen ruling as equals. It was a beautiful dream. Beautiful dreams are often the most dangerous kind. Outside, Alexandria continued its daily rhythm. Merchants sold bread in the markets. Fishermen mended their nets by the harbor. Children played in the palace courtyards. Life persisted, as it always does, even after love dies. But something fundamental had shifted. The world felt smaller somehow, more ordinary. Magic requires two people believing in it at the same time. When one of them stops believing, when one of them stops breathing, the spell breaks. What remains is just history. This is how legends end, not with grand battles or stirring speeches, but with regret and silence, and the slow realization that some stories don't have happy endings. Antony and Cleopatra had rewritten the rules of power, of love, of what was possible between two extraordinary people. But in the end, they were still mortal, still human, still subject to the cruel mathematics of time and chance and the sharp edges of their own desperate hearts, still capable of breaking completely. By the summer of 30 BCE, Cleopatra's world had shrunk to the size of her own palace walls. The woman who once commanded the wealth of Egypt now counted her remaining allies on one hand. Outside Alexandria's harbor, Octavian's ships blocked every escape route. But inside her marble halls, something extraordinary was happening. Cleopatra wasn't breaking, she was planning. Even cornered, the last pharaoh refused to simply wait for defeat. Her servants noticed the change first, the way she walked through her chambers with renewed purpose. The hours spent in her private study, scrolls scattered across cedar tables. Cleopatra had survived palace coups, Roman civil wars, and the deaths of brothers. This felt different, quieter somehow, like watching a master strategist play her final game. Her movements had the precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. She sent one last message to Octavian, a request that seemed almost humble. Could she perform the burial rites for Mark Antony, the man who had died in her arms just days earlier, believing she was already dead? The request puzzled Octavian's advisors. Why would she care about ceremony now? But Cleopatra understood something they didn't. Every pharaoh needed to prepare for their journey to the afterlife, including herself. The tomb of Alexander the Great had always been her refuge. As a child, she'd stood before his crystal sarcophagus, listening to stories of the boy king who conquered the world by 25. Now she knelt beside Antony's body, whispering words in ancient Egyptian that hadn't been spoken aloud in generations. Her fingers traced symbols on his forehead, symbols that would guide him safely to the underworld. Octavian granted her request, perhaps thinking grief had finally broken her spirit. He couldn't have been more wrong. Cleopatra returned to her palace that evening with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just checked the most important item off their list. She called for her bath to be drawn, sent word to the kitchen for her favorite meal, even requested her finest silk robes, the gold ones embroidered with lotus flowers. August 12th, 30 BCE, the morning air in Alexandria carried the smell of jasmine from the palace gardens. Cleopatra woke before dawn, as had been her habit for 39 years of life. But this morning felt different, quieter. She stood on her balcony, watching the sun paint the harbor gold one last time. Below, fishermen prepared their nets, unaware they were witnessing the final dawn of pharaonic Egypt. Her two most trusted servants, Eris and Charmian, had been with her since childhood. They understood without words what this day would bring. The three women moved through familiar routines: the ritual bath, the careful application of kohl around her eyes, the selection of jewelry. But every gesture carried the weight of ceremony now. They were preparing not just a queen, but the last link to a 3,000-year dynasty. The meal arrived at midday: figs from the Nile Delta, bread still warm from the palace ovens, wine from grapes that grew in soil, blessed by ancient floods. Cleopatra ate slowly, savoring flavors that connected her to every pharaoh who had come before. Outside her chamber door, Roman guards waited. Inside, time moved differently, suspended in the space between decision and action, between courage and surrender. What happened next remains one of history's most beautiful mysteries. Some say a farmer arrived at the palace gates, carrying a basket of figs, the sweetest ones from his orchard, he told the guards, a gift for the queen's final meal. The guards, perhaps moved by the gesture, allowed him through. Inside that basket, hidden beneath purple fruit, still warm from the Egyptian sun, lay Cleopatra's chosen path to freedom. The asp sacred to the goddess Wadjet, protector of pharaohs. Whether the story is true hardly matters now. What matters is the choice it represents, the decision to leave this world on her own terms rather than be paraded through Rome as a trophy. Cleopatra had seen what happened to conquered queens. She'd watched them stumble behind golden chariots while crowds jeered. Death, she reasoned, was a far gentler master than humiliation. She lay back on her couch, the same one where she'd received Julius Caesar 20 years earlier, the same silk cushions where she'd planned military campaigns and negotiated trade agreements with merchants from India. Now it would serve as her final throne. Eris and Charmian took their places beside her, loyal to the very end. 3 lives intertwined since childhood, choosing to step into eternity together. When Octavian's men found them hours later, they discovered something unexpected. Not the defeated enemy they'd come to arrest, but a tableau of dignity that stopped them at the doorway. Cleopatra lay in perfect repose, her gold diadem still gleaming on her forehead, her servants beside her, hands arranged as if they were simply sleeping. The room itself felt sacred, untouchable. Even Roman soldiers understood they were witnessing something larger than politics. The physicians searched for wounds, but found none. No blood, no signs of violence. Just 3 women who had chosen their exit with the same precision they'd once used to govern an empire. Modern doctors suggest various possibilities: poison hidden in a hollow comb, perhaps, or toxin painted on a pin. But the ancient world preferred its mystery. The ass became legend because legends, unlike empires, can never truly die. Octavian stood in that chamber for a long time, studying the woman who had challenged Rome's greatest generals and nearly won. Even in death, Cleopatra had managed to surprise him. He'd expected tears, pleading, desperate bargains for mercy. Instead, he found himself face to face with the ultimate political statement, a final act of defiance wrapped in silk and gold, impossible to counter or diminish. She was 39 years old, the same age Alexander had been when he died in Babylon, dreaming of new worlds to conquer. But where Alexander's empire crumbled within years of his death, Cleopatra achieved something more lasting. She transformed herself from historical figure into eternal symbol the queen who chose love over safety, passion over pragmatism, and dignity over survival. Her story became larger than any single life. With Cleopatra's death, the age of the pharaohs ended forever. Egypt became a Roman province, its treasures shipped north to fill Octavian's coffers. But something else traveled north too. Stories, tales of the queen who spoke 9 languages, who disguised herself as a goddess, who loved 2 of Rome's greatest leaders, and nearly changed the course of history. Stories that would outlive empires, inspiring poets and dreamers for thousands of years to come. August 30th, 30 BCE, Alexandria falls silent. The bodies of Mark Antony and Cleopatra lie still in the royal mausoleum. Their love story ended, but their consequences just beginning. Octavian stands in the palace courtyard, 23 years old, surveying an empire that suddenly belongs to him. Egypt's golden treasures gleam in the morning light, enough wealth to fund Rome's armies for decades. The young victor breathes deeply. This moment will reshape the world. The news travels faster than anyone expects. Roman messengers gallop west across dusty roads, carrying word of the double suicide back to Rome. In the forum, crowds gather around public speakers, straining to hear each detail. Some weep for Mark Antony, the war hero they once cheered. Others whisper about Cleopatra's final act, wondering if she truly died from an asp's bite or chose poison instead. The city holds its breath, waiting. Octavian moves quickly through the palace rooms, cataloging everything. Cleopatra's private chambers still smell of jasmine and frankincense. Her astronomical instruments sit untouched on marble tables. Scrolls containing centuries of Ptolemaic records line the walls. He understands immediately this isn't just conquest, it's inheritance. Egypt's knowledge, its trade routes, its grain harvests, all of it now flows directly into Roman hands. The Mediterranean has become a Roman lake. In Rome, senators pace marble corridors nervously. With Antony dead and Octavian triumphant, the delicate balance they've maintained for decades crumbles overnight. Some had supported Antony quietly, hoping to hedge their bets. Others had remained neutral, watching from the sidelines. Now they face an uncomfortable reality. There's only one man left standing. They rehearse their congratulations carefully, knowing that survival depends on saying exactly the right words at exactly the right moment. Cleopatra's children present Octavian with an impossible choice. Caesarion, 17 years old, claims to be Julius Caesar's son, a living challenge to Octavian's own adoption by Caesar. The boy's resemblance to the murdered dictator is unmistakable. Cleopatra's younger children, by Antony, watch from the shadows, too young to understand the danger they represent. Each breath they take threatens Octavian's carefully constructed legitimacy. Some decisions, he realizes, cannot be delayed. The Egyptian priesthood kneels before Octavian in the great temple of Ptah in Memphis. They've served pharaohs for over 3,000 years, adapting to each new dynasty with practiced grace. Now they offer him the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the ancient symbols of divine kingship. But Octavian hesitates. He understands the power of symbols. Accepting the crown might make him pharaoh to Egyptians, but it would make him foreign king to Romans. The balance requires careful thought. Alexandria's markets slowly reopen as Roman soldiers patrol the streets. Merchants eye the newcomers cautiously, uncertain whether their businesses will survive the transition. The great library continues its work, scholars copying manuscripts as they have for centuries, pretending not to notice how the political winds have shifted. In the harbor, Roman galleys unload fresh troops while Egyptian ships sit idle. The city adapts as it always has, but something essential has changed forever. Back in Rome, Octavian's supporters celebrate in the streets. They drape temples with laurel wreaths and pour wine libations to the gods, thanking them for delivering victory. But older citizens remember the civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination 13 years earlier. They've seen how quickly celebration can turn to bloodshed when powerful men compete for ultimate authority. Joy mixes with wariness as they wonder what comes next. Peace, finally, or simply a different kind of struggle for power. The Egyptian treasure ships arrive in Ostia throughout the autumn months. Gold, silver, precious stones, ivory, exotic spices, wealth beyond anything Romans have ever imagined flows into the city. Octavian distributes generous bonuses to his veterans, paying them more than they've ever seen. The soldiers, satisfied and enriched, disband peacefully to their farms and workshops. For the first time in decades, Roman legions march home without immediately preparing for another civil war. Money, it seems, can indeed buy peace. Octavian studies the administrative systems Cleopatra perfected over her 21-year reign. Her tax collection methods, her grain distribution networks, her diplomatic correspondence, all of it reveals a ruler of extraordinary competence. He begins to understand why Caesar and Antony both fell under her influence. This wasn't simply physical attraction or political convenience. Cleopatra genuinely understood how to govern a complex, multicultural empire. Her methods will serve Rome well, adapted carefully to Roman sensibilities and Roman law. The Roman calendar changes as Octavian consolidates his authority. January 1st, 29 BCE marks the beginning of his first consulship as sole ruler of Rome. He closes the doors of the Temple of Janus, the ancient ritual that signals the end of warfare. Citizens gather to witness the ceremony, many weeping with relief. Their children will grow up without the constant threat of civil war. The Republic, as their grandfathers knew it, has ended, but stability finally seems within reach. In the countryside around Alexandria, farmers plant their crops as the Nile floods recede. The rhythm of Egyptian agriculture continues unchanged, indifferent to political upheaval. Roman engineers study the irrigation systems that have sustained this land for millennia, learning techniques they'll later apply throughout the empire. Egypt's greatest gift to Rome isn't gold or grain, it's knowledge accumulated over 3,000 years of continuous civilization. Octavian begins to appreciate the true value of his conquest. Artists in Rome begin crafting the official version of recent events. Poets compose verses celebrating Octavian's triumph over foreign influence. Sculptors carve reliefs showing Egypt kneeling before Roman eagles. The propaganda machine that once vilified Cleopatra now transforms her into a cautionary tale about the dangers of Eastern luxury corrupting Roman virtue. History, as always, belongs to the victors, but whispered stories of her intelligence and dignity persist in Alexandria's shadowed alleyways. The Mediterranean world holds its breath as news of the settlement spreads to every port and province. In Athens, philosophers debate what this means for Greek culture under Roman dominance. In Jerusalem, priests wonder how the new regime will treat Jewish communities. In Gaul, tribal leaders calculate whether this distant political shift affects their own delicate relationships with Roman governors. Everyone understands an era has ended. Something entirely new is beginning to take shape across the ancient world. Octavian walks through Rome's streets as winter deepens, observing how his victory has changed the city's atmosphere. Vendors call out cheerfully, no longer fearing that civil war might disrupt their businesses tomorrow. Children play war games, pretending to be Roman soldiers conquering Egypt. The Eternal City feels different now, confident in a way it hasn't for decades. But Octavian knows that maintaining this peace will require different skills than winning it. The hardest work still lies ahead. As 29 BCE draws to a close, Octavian prepares for his return to Rome as undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. Behind him, Egypt settles into its new reality as a Roman province. Ahead lies the delicate task of transforming military victory into lasting political stability. The love affair that began in Tarsus 14 years earlier has finally ended, not in wedding bells, but in imperial transformation. Mark Antony and Cleopatra's passion reshaped the ancient world forever. Chapter 14: The Indelible Echoes. 2,000 years have passed since Cleopatra pressed the asp to her breast. 2,000 years since Mark Antony fell on his sword in that dusty Alexandria palace. Yet here we are, still whispering their names in the dark, still telling their story to anyone who'll listen. Their bones are dust, their empire crumbled into sand, but something about their love, something about the way they chose each other over everything else, refuses to die. The Romans tried to erase them from memory. Octavian ordered Caesarion killed, had statues torn down, rewrote the histories to make Cleopatra nothing but a seductress, a foreign temptress who corrupted noble Roman blood. But stories have a way of surviving the people who try to bury them. In the shadows of libraries, in whispered poems, in paintings hidden away from imperial eyes, their truth lived on. Love always finds a way to outlast the hatred that tries to destroy it. Shakespeare found them in Plutarch's dusty pages 500 years ago. Read about this Egyptian queen and her Roman general, and saw something that made his quill tremble with excitement. He gave them poetry, language that burned like their passion, words that made audiences in London theaters weep for lovers who'd been dead for centuries. I am fire and air, my other elements I give to baser life. Even the bard couldn't resist their pull. Artists painted them in Renaissance chambers, their faces glowing with candlelight and desire. Tiepolo's Cleopatra, regal and defiant, at her final banquet. Delacroix's lovers, wrapped in silk and shadow. Each generation saw something different in their story. The Victorians made her exotic and dangerous. The 20th century found rebellion against empire. We see what we need to see, what our own hearts are hungry for. Hollywood discovered them in the golden age of cinema. Elizabeth Taylor's violet eyes, Richard Burton's voice like gravel and honey. $50 million, the most expensive film ever made at the time. Critics called it excess. Bankruptcy nearly followed, but audiences understood something the studio executives didn't. Some stories are worth bankrupting empires for. Some loves are worth any cost. Even 2,000 years later, we still believe in grand passion. The real Cleopatra spoke 9 languages, read philosophy by lamplight, negotiated treaties that kept Egypt independent for decades. But history remembers her beauty, her seduction, her dramatic death. Maybe because we need our women to be mysteries. Maybe because powerful queens make uncomfortable truths. She was brilliant, ruthless when needed, tender with her children, a ruler who put her kingdom above everything except one Roman general who changed everything. Mark Antony haunts Roman literature like a ghost. The writers couldn't decide, was he hero or villain? Noble general corrupted by foreign magic, or man who found something worth dying for? Plutarch tried to be fair, showed his courage in Gaul, his generosity to soldiers, his final moments calling Cleopatra's name. History judges harshly those who choose love over duty, but sometimes, late at night, we wonder if they were the only ones who got it right. Their children disappeared from history's pages. Caesarion murdered at 17, his crime being Caesar's son. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, sun and moon, taken to Rome as living trophies. Only Selene survived to adulthood, became Queen of Mauritania, carried her parents' blood into Africa. Sometimes I wonder if she ever sat in her palace, watching the Mediterranean, remembering her mother's voice, singing Egyptian lullabies in the dark. Alexandria's great library burned its scrolls, turning to ash and memory. The lighthouse fell to earthquakes, its beacon dark forever. Cleopatra's palaces sank beneath the harbor waves, marble columns now home to fish and coral. But their story, their impossible love story, survived every fire, every flood, every empire that rose and fell. Some things are too beautiful to die, too human to forget, too true to stay buried forever. Every generation finds them again. Byron wrote verses about her. Napoleon carried Plutarch's lives through Egypt, dreaming of his own Cleopatra. Modern archaeologists dive into Alexandria's sunken ruins, searching for traces of her touch on ancient stone. Historians debate her ethnicity, her intelligence, her motives, but the questions miss the point. She existed, she loved, she chose death over defeat. Some truths need no archaeology. The coins survive. Bronze discs stamped with her profile, nose strong and regal, chin raised in defiance. Not Hollywood beautiful, but commanding, intelligent. This is the woman who sailed to Antony in gold and purple, who spoke to Caesar in perfect Latin, who killed herself rather than walk in chains through Rome. The coins don't lie. Power has its own beauty, strength its own seduction. She knew exactly what she was doing. Octavian won their war, became Augustus Caesar, ruled for 45 years, built roads and aqueducts, brought peace to the Mediterranean, died beloved and honored. History called him great, but no one writes love songs about Augustus. No one dreams of his passion. Victory isn't always triumph. Sometimes the losers win forever because they chose something more dangerous than power. They chose to be remembered for how deeply they could feel. In Cairo's narrow streets, in Rome's ancient squares, tour guides still tell their story to wide-eyed visitors. Point to ruins where their feet once walked, to waters where their ships once sailed. The details change with each telling, but the heart stays the same. Two people found each other across the vast loneliness of power, chose each other over empires, died rather than live apart. The rest is just history. We keep making movies about them, writing novels, painting their faces, not because we understand them, but because something in their story calls to the part of us that believes in impossible things, that knows sometimes love really can move mountains, topple empires, outlast death itself. They remind us that passion exists, that some people risk everything for someone else, that choosing love over safety is still somehow the most human thing of all. Their tombs were lost to time and sand. No monuments mark where they fell. No temples honor their memory. But walk through any museum, any library, any theater, and you'll find them in bronze coins and marble fragments, in Shakespeare's folios and Hollywood reels, in the dreams of anyone who's ever risked everything for love. They became the story they always were, not rulers of Egypt and Rome, but rulers of the human heart. 2,000 years from now, when our cities are dust and our names forgotten, someone will still whisper theirs in the dark, still tell the story of the Egyptian queen and her Roman general who chose love over everything else, who proved that some things are stronger than empires, deeper than death, more enduring than stone. They echo still in every heart that dares to love without counting the cost. Their legend lives because love never dies. Their bodies are dust now. Alexandria's palaces crumbled into sand centuries ago. The Roman Forum, where senators once plotted against them, ruins where tourists take pictures. But somehow, impossibly, Antony and Cleopatra are still here, still whispering to us across 20 centuries, still making our hearts race with the memory of a love so fierce it nearly toppled an empire. How does a story survive when everything else fades? Maybe it's because they loved the way we all want to love, completely, recklessly, without counting the cost. When Cleopatra sailed to meet Antony, dressed as Aphrodite, she wasn't just seducing a Roman general, she was declaring that love deserved spectacle. That passion was worth gold cloth and perfumed sails and music drifting across the water. She was saying, love should be magnificent, even if it destroys you. In museums around the world, tourists lean over glass cases, studying ancient coins. Antony's face stamped in silver, Cleopatra's profile etched in gold. Their features worn smooth by time, but their names still whispered in dozens of languages. French schoolchildren learn about them. Japanese scholars write dissertations. Hollywood keeps remaking their story. Death couldn't kill them. They found immortality in the one place that mattered, human memory. Shakespeare understood something profound about their story. When he wrote Antony and Cleopatra, he made them larger than history, more real than fact. His Cleopatra doesn't just die, she transforms. I am fire and air, she declares. My other elements I give to baser life. Even in death, she's claiming victory. Love made her elemental, eternal, something that couldn't be conquered by Roman swords or the passage of time. Walk through any art gallery. Paintings of Cleopatra line the walls. Some show her as Egyptian goddess, others as Renaissance queen. Artists who never saw Alexandria imagined her beauty differently across the centuries, but they all captured the same thing, the magnetism, the power, the woman who made the most powerful man in Rome forget everything else. Even when we don't know her true face, we know her essence. Their love letters are lost now, burned when Alexandria fell, or crumbled to dust in some forgotten archive. We'll never read Antony's promises to her, or Cleopatra's midnight confessions, but somehow their love still speaks, in every couple who chooses each other over safety, in every heart that risks everything for someone else. Their words vanished, but their courage echoes through every real love story since. What makes their story eternal isn't the crown jewels or golden ships, it's the smaller moments we can imagine. Antony watching Cleopatra read scrolls by lamplight, her hand finding his during some late night council meeting, the way they must have looked at each other when Rome's ultimatum arrived, knowing their world was ending. Love in the face of impossible odds, that's what never gets old. Octavian won the war, but he lost the story. His propaganda painted them as decadent enemies of Rome, drunk on luxury, weak with passion. But propaganda fades, truth endures, and the truth is, they chose love over empire. They chose each other over everything else they'd ever wanted. In a world obsessed with power and conquest, that choice still feels revolutionary, still feels brave. Every generation rediscovers them. Victorian poets made them tragic romantics. Hollywood turned them into movie stars. Modern historians argue about their politics, but the love story remains constant. Two brilliant people who found each other across cultures and languages, who built something beautiful in a brutal world, who chose passion over prudence and paid the ultimate price, who loved so completely that death itself couldn't diminish them. In Alexandria's ruins, archaeologists sometimes find fragments, a piece of painted plaster, a broken wine jar, remnants of parties they might have attended, rooms where they might have whispered plans. The physical evidence is scattered, fragmentary, but the emotional truth remains whole, perfect, unbroken. Love this deep doesn't need artifacts to prove it existed. It proves itself by refusing to be forgotten. Their children lived, scattered across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra Selene became Queen of Mauritania, carrying her mother's name into another generation. Alexander Helios vanished from history, but his bloodline continued somewhere. Caesarion, we don't know his fate, but their legacy wasn't just genetic, it was spiritual. The idea that love could be worth a kingdom, worth everything, worth death itself if necessary. Rome built roads and aqueducts that still stand today, engineering marvels, practical immortality in stone and concrete. But Antony and Cleopatra built something different. They built a love story so powerful that it outlasted the Roman Empire itself. Their passion became legend. Legend became myth. And myths live forever in the human heart, passed down like sacred fire from one generation to the next. Maybe that's why we can't let them go. In a world that values safety over passion, duty over desire, they remind us that love is supposed to be dangerous, transformative, world-changing. They loved like gods, recklessly, magnificently, without apology. They show us what we're capable of when we stop playing it safe, when we choose the person over the plan, the heart over the head. The lighthouse of Alexandria, gone. The great library, ashes. Cleopatra's palaces, somewhere beneath Mediterranean waves. Every monument to their power has crumbled or vanished, but their love story, that endures, it survives in every whispered tale of lovers who defied the world, in every heart that chooses passion over prudence. They achieved the only immortality that matters. They live in our imagination. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, you can almost see them, Antony's hand reaching for Cleopatra's across a dinner table in some lost palace, her laugh echoing through marble halls. The way they must have looked at each other, knowing they'd found something worth dying for. Love that refuses to be reasonable. Love that changes everything. Love that burns eternal, even when the lovers themselves have turned to dust. This is their true victory, not the battles won or territories claimed, but this, the way they still make us believe, in love worth fighting for, in passion worth dying for, in the possibility that two people can find each other across impossible odds and create something so beautiful that it echoes through eternity. Antony and Cleopatra, still together, still teaching us how to love without limits.